Welcome to Thinking Green. This is the first show of our 15th season. It's really kind of hard to believe, but we started this show in fall of 2004 and have been going strong 9 months a year since then. So it's kind of exciting to think about that. And as is usual for the month of October, we try to introduce viewers to various Green Party candidates who are running in the current year's elections. Sometimes it is not so hard for Green Party candidates to get their faces and ideas out to the public. So we're trying to do our own small part. So tonight's guest, with that in mind, is Peter Goselin. He is a Connecticut attorney who specializes in workplace rights and civil rights. And he is running for the position of Attorney General. So we're going to talk to Peter about his positions, about what the job entails, and some of the other things that have happened to him on the campaign trail. So welcome, Peter.
Well, thank you, and happy 14th anniversary.
Yeah, isn't that exciting? So I guess the first thing I wanted to ask you is, you obviously have a law practice and your life is pretty busy. Why have you taken on this run for Attorney General?
Well, that might actually be the toughest question that anybody's asked me so far, because I'm not sure that I have a really good answer. I do think that looking at the statewide candidates this year, looking at the Connecticut elections this year, in a lot of other places in the country, there's a lot of voices for progressive change. Some of them are inside the Democratic Party, some of them are in Green Party or in other independent parties. But that has, to a large extent, not been the case in Connecticut. In fact, the progressives, mostly in the Democratic Party, have mostly gotten their butts kicked in the last in the primaries. They ran some really great campaigns, but not successfully. And I think it's really important that this year, especially, that we take on some really tough questions that we know that the machine Democrats and the machine Republicans are not going to be able to take on, that they don't want to take on. They don't want to hear about these things. And all the more reason why we need to drag them into the light.
And I've noticed when you mentioned the Democrats in Connecticut have kind of been immune to the wave of progressivity that has happened in a lot of the country. I just saw a friend of mine who's been very concerned with the direction our state university system has been going under the Malloy administration, and just heard what Lamont had to say about his ideas, and she's thinking there's going to be no one for her to vote for in November in that race, and that is sad. And we don't have a Green Party candidate either.
Right. Well, after I announced that I was going to run, a lot of folks that I knew in circles that were not political circles, I had folks coming up to me and saying, "I'm glad you're running because there's somebody I can vote for." And I think they were expressing, among other things, they were expressing an incredible frustration with the Connecticut Democratic Party, which, traditionally has held itself out as the party of civil rights, the party of organized labor, even the peace party sometimes. And it doesn't stand for any of those things at the moment. We've got the Democratic Party right now. It's a kind of a schizophrenia. On the one hand, the labor unions have all lined up behind the Democratic Party candidates. Democratic Party candidates are making it plain that they're going to attack state workers when the elections are over.
Right.
They are, the Democratic Party rank and file are incredibly frustrated, and they're incredibly angry. And there's an awful lot of working class people who really want some kind of an alternative. And right now, especially this year, I think we've become kind of a lightning rod for that.
Well, I hope that it does bring attention to the issues and push some of the Democrats a little bit towards the left, because even our federal candidates here, Joe Courtney in Congress and Chris Murphy in Congress, 6 years ago, I mean, those two men have moved right in the last 6 years.
Yes.
From what their platforms were when they first were elected, I think 8 years ago and 6 years ago, respectively. And so it's really troubling that they've obviously felt pressure from the right. I don't know that they felt pressure from the left. So I guess the next thing to talk about is, like, what does the Attorney General of Connecticut do? What would, I think a lot of people think of the Attorney General as being, the ultimate consumer advocate, but I'm guessing that isn't the whole job.
Well, it isn't the whole job. On the other hand, there are a lot of folks who would think off the top of your head. They might very well think that the Attorney General in Connecticut plays the role that Attorney Generals do in many other states, in that person is also in charge of the criminal prosecution system, which in Connecticut is not the case. In fact, it's kind of indicative, I think, of where the real power lies, because the governor appoints the state attorneys who prosecute people for crimes, but the civil authority is elected by the people. And I think it's kind of interesting that the governor reserves that authority to itself rather than it being something that is elected. But in any event, the Attorney General in Connecticut is the highest level civil authority for litigation. And it has historically, over the last 10, 20 years, one of its major functions has been to advocate for consumers and participate in class actions. And that certainly has been an important function, but it's certainly not the only thing that it could do. As I see it, the Attorney General is really the last line of defense for the enforcement of any legal issues that protect the interests of working people and disenfranchised people in particular in Connecticut. So the Attorney General should be the one speaking up about the fact that we have federal immigration agents in Connecticut courthouses. In fact, here in New London, I know that's been the case.
That has been the case.
Yeah, and that's a really chilling thought, that you have somebody who needs to have access to the court for any number of reasons, who might feel that they can't do that they can't go to the court building because they might encounter somebody from immigration authority who might detain them, who might detain and deport them. That's that's interference with access to the courts, and it's a violation of the Connecticut Constitution. And it's something that the Attorney General should be raising with the federal government. The federal government doesn't have the right to interfere with our justice system. And
I'm guessing no one has told ICE they can't be here.
No, absolutely not. There are certain things that are just treated as completely off the table, so that when people are frantically calling the Attorney General's office and saying, why in the world is President Trump kidnapping these children and keeping them in concentration camps, then at that point, George Jepsen's office, the incumbent Attorney General, joins a lawsuit that was brought by other states to try to do something about that. But his office has done nothing to address the situation of immigrants in Connecticut. It has not addressed the fact that there are state authorities who are actually violating the law with respect to Connecticut law, with respect to the handling of immigrants in the correction system and in the judicial system. It's a very serious problem with serious ramifications for families who live in Connecticut, but it's something that's off the table as far as they're concerned. They don't want to be involved in it.
It sounds like they think it's a safer route for them, obviously not for the families.
And I would say that if there is a watchword for the Attorney General's office in terms of how it exercises its authority, it's to do what's safe. So, litigating against tobacco companies, of course, it's a great
Right.
idea. That's a very important thing, but it's also incredibly safe. On the other hand, litigating against the companies that are responsible for the opioid epidemic, well, they were a little bit slower to get on board with that. Litigating against the federal government for interfering with the rights of people here in Connecticut because of its immigration policies, well, they're even slower to do that.
Well, the city of New London several months ago passed a resolution not exactly making it a sanctuary city, but conferring, some rights on immigrants who live here. And one of the most interesting arguments I heard in favor of our city doing that and not giving full access to ICE or cooperating with ICE was, would we want our government to be cooperating with the IRS the way we're cooperating with ICE? Do we want tax evaders to be, knocked on the door by our local officials doing the IRS's job? So,
right, exactly. In fact, it's interesting because one of the things that I would always say about, I think now more and more people have come to recognize that the term illegal alien to describe someone who's an undocumented immigrant is a really wrong-headed term. But one of the reasons I've always argued that it was particularly wrong-headed was I say, if somebody cheats on their taxes, nobody calls them an illegal taxpayer.
Right.
I mean, that's not a term we would ever use. Like, that doesn't mean anything.
Right.
Like, somehow you become an illegal person because you cheated on your taxes. And yeah, I think it's kind of ironic because if anything, I would imagine that folks in Connecticut would be among those to scream the loudest if suddenly federal agents were appearing in schools and courthouses and at people's doorsteps and at their places of work saying, oh no, all we're doing is enforcing the tax laws against the people who are breaking the tax laws. We would recognize that as being a horrible infringement on people's rights. And we have been reluctant to extend that same understanding to the rights of immigrant families in Connecticut.
Now, as you were talking in the beginning about some of what's the problems we have in Connecticut, I couldn't help but think that Connecticut is a wealthy state in a way, but we have one of the widest wealth gaps of any state in the country. So, is there anything that can happen from the point of view of an Attorney General's office to equalize the rights between the haves and the have-nots?
Well, I think there are a couple of places where the Attorney General's office definitely has the authority to take action. And one of them, which does not directly go to the issue of the income gap, but it certainly has to do with the issue of racial segregation. Connecticut is not only a state divided between rich and poor, it's also very much a state divided between black and white communities, or black and Latino communities and white communities. And the racial divide is something that exists right alongside of that financial divide, really. And one of the things that folks who live in most cities in Connecticut are very conscious of is the problem of the friction between communities, particularly communities of color, and local police departments, and the extent to which the police have come to treat their role in communities of color, in Bridgeport, in Hartford, in New Haven, Waterbury,
including New London.
And New London too, that's right, to a lesser extent, but New London, there are no communities that are really immune to this. There is a tendency to treat communities of color as if the role of the police is to be an occupation army, not to protect the citizens who are living there, but to somehow focus on keeping them down, maintaining order, being about law and order rather than being about protecting and serving. And we've seen some really horrific examples of that in the last couple of years, mostly involving youth of color, including some instances of really brutal abuse by police officers in Hartford and in Bridgeport and New Britain. Bridgeport, New Britain, and Hamden have all, in the last year or so, have had incidents in which young men were killed in high-speed car chases with the police. And I know that there's a sort of an everyday logic that says, oh, well, don't run away from the police, and then you won't be involved in a high-speed chase. But police officers understand that when they're engaged in a high-speed chase through a residential community, they are putting the people in that community at risk. And they are putting them at risk to an extent that really is completely out of touch with the laws that they're supposedly enforcing. So we have these situations where young people are being brutalized and killed by the police. It definitely falls along a black-white divide. Folks in the cities know this. Folks in the suburbs have chosen to ignore it. One of the things that I've argued is that the Attorney General's office has a responsibility to enforce our civil rights laws even against local police departments. That if there's evidence that local police departments are violating people's rights in a systemic way, and I believe that evidence definitely exists, that the Attorney General should be enforcing the Connecticut Constitution, enforcing Connecticut equal protection laws on behalf of these young people, so that their rights are properly respected, and so that the police don't feel free to behave as if they're an occupation army in their communities.
Now, if a person goes onto your website or looks at your literature, the first thing you write is about racial profiling. So I actually went, oh gosh, maybe in about 2011 or 12, up to the LOB in Hartford to talk about strengthening the Penn Act.
Yes.
So what's the status now, and what do we still need to do?
Well, the proposal that I have heard the most discussion about in terms of strengthening the Penn Act involves providing essentially in incidents of police stopping moving vehicles in particular, but any situation where the police have an encounter and they give a ticket or a fine, that they have to provide a receipt to the person who is being charged, and that receipt has to reflect, among other things, the information that the police officer has about that person's race and ethnicity. One of the reasons being that there's a long history, as you know, there's a long history, in spite of the Penn Act, of Connecticut police departments failing to keep those kinds of records, or in cases where they have kept those records, the records have gone for long periods of time without being reviewed. And when they are finally reviewed, what we see is that there are certain kinds of laws that are overwhelmingly being carried out on a regular basis by police officers against people of color. People talk about, in fact, a friend of mine who's a longtime police officer for the state talked about the sunset rule, that after sunset, the rate at which police will stop vehicles for certain kinds of offenses goes down. And the reason it goes down is that after dark, they're not able to tell the race of the people who are driving the cars.
Wow. Well, when I went to the LOB, one thing I think that was happening was that the person who was stopped did not get a copy of the report. And there was one Haitian gentleman who, when he finally got a copy through whatever channels he needed to go through, it said he was white.
Yeah, yeah.
So there is a history of also some falsification of data on these receipts if they're not given to the driver at the same time.
Sure. In those communities in which the department and the leadership in the department had not enforced the rules about maintaining these records, police officers simply didn't make record of it. In those communities where the rules were being enforced, they've engaged in falsification, they've provided misleading information, they've left things blank, and when the information is accurate, what we see over and over again is that people of color are being disproportionately affected by these laws. It's really no different from what happened in New York City when they were examining the stop and frisk laws, that it turned out that stop and frisk was having virtually no positive impact on crime, that it was highly unlikely, that there was very little relationship between the people who were being stopped and people who were committing crimes. But there was a strong relationship between the decisions police officers were making about who to stop and their race, so that some person of color was 5 times more likely to be stopped by a police officer when stop and frisk was in effect in New York City than a white person was. And it wasn't corresponding to criminal conduct or anything that they could point to. It simply reflected bias by the police officers, which they were allowed to act upon.
And we've seen this over and over with the war on drugs, that, people of different, whites and blacks use drugs at roughly the same rates, probably whites a little bit more, and yet you look at who's incarcerated for it, and it's a totally different proportion.
It certainly hasn't gone unnoticed that the opioid crisis that we've been seeing over the last few years has been treated as a healthcare crisis. And you and I remember when when heroin was the issue of the day, and it was a law and order crisis. Black men were doing heroin and they were going to jail. White people are doing opioids and they're going into treatment. Now, I mean, the opioid crisis.
We don't want everyone to be going into jail.
No, we do. Very much the opposite. We want people to be going into treatment. We want to have drug programs that actually are treating people, treating addiction as an illness and as a mental health issue. There are a lot of things that we can do in order to better deal with the opioid crisis. And none of them really have to do with putting people in jail or charging them criminally. But nonetheless, there is this history of having treated these kinds of problems one way when they affect primarily the black community, and another way when they primarily affect white people.
And thinking about things where the white communities' experience might be quite different from our communities of color, I'd like to touch on our education system, which I think has been shown to be not very equitable from town to town based on income.
Not equitable, and gotten worse over the years and become more and more an issue of racial division. I mean, it's really kind of a horrifying thing to see playing out over time, that this is something that's been in litigation since the 1980s, and yet it's clearly not getting better. When I was contemplating the idea of running for Attorney General, one of the things that caught my attention, and it really struck me thinking about this issue, is that the Connecticut Constitution mirrors the federal Constitution in a lot of respects, and it looks very much like the constitutions of other states. Connecticut Constitution happens to have in its equal protection language something that the federal Constitution doesn't, which is the constitutional right to equal protection in education. That all of the residents of the state of Connecticut, all the children of the state of Connecticut, have a right under the Connecticut Constitution to a quality education. And clearly that's a right that's being violated every day. And it's only getting worse. The closing of community schools, the siphoning of money for public schools into charters, the attacks on teachers' unions, all of these things are they're literally depriving young people of the opportunity to get a decent education. And obviously it's not something the Attorney General has the authority to address themselves, but I do think it's a bully pulpit from which to point out the fact that as the officer with the responsibility for enforcing Connecticut civil law, that Connecticut has a blatantly unconstitutional method of school funding that has created this racial and both a racial divide and also a divide based on class. So that Connecticut has, in the same way that we have some of the wealthiest communities and some of the poorest communities, we also have some of the best schools and some of the worst schools in the country. So that if you happen to be living in Bridgeport or Hartford, the quality of your schools look nothing at all. They bear no resemblance whatsoever to the school that might be a half a mile down the road on the other side of the border.
Well, south of the Mason-Dixon line and in the west part of the country, schools are more often funded on a county level than a town level. And I'm sure big cities, it wouldn't really help so much, but in Connecticut, every county with a poor city in it, like, think of Fairfield, Bridgeport is quite a poor city, but all the other towns in that county are really wealthy, and you'd think that if funding might be able to be accomplished on a county-wide basis, we could solve a few problems.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I would argue that with respect to education, that we have to get away from this incredibly archaic system of school funding based on local property taxes. And Connecticut is a pretty small state. It's
nonetheless, we have 169
we have
towns.
169 school districts. Actually, more than 169
we have
school districts,
172
right?
or something like that.
So we have 172 school districts, and these school districts are being funded by local property taxes. Of course, there's going to be gross inequality. And frankly, it is also a system that the folks who are benefiting from want very much to keep. But at some point, they're going to have to come to grips with the fact that we can't have this kind of inequality. Myself, I would argue that Connecticut is small enough that we should simply have a state system of education, responsible not only for funding on a state level and making sure that poor communities get the funding they need to get the same kinds of resources that wealthier towns have, but also that it would be a great way of making sure that the curriculum in Connecticut schools reflects the kinds of values that we want. I think that if you want to have a curriculum in the arts and literature that accurately reflects the people who live in Connecticut, you want to have a curriculum that includes the art and literature of people of Puerto Rico, of the African diaspora, of Latinos from all parts of Latin America, as well as the what we would think of as the classics that we encounter and that we tend to encounter in the classroom.
The old colonists.
Yeah, exactly. The old colonists. Herman Melville and Nathaniel Hawthorne and Wadsworth Longfellow. There's nothing wrong with studying those, these authors. But if those are the only authors we're studying, it means that we're not actually talking about the real life experience and culture of a significant part of the state.
Now, one thing you had mentioned, I think last time you were on the show, and I think it comes up on your platform, about how the Attorney General can find out what needs to be done in the state about, you're sitting in an office in Hartford, how do you know where the problems are?
I want to talk about that, and I want to preface it with something about the way that I approach the task of identifying how the Attorney General could take on some of the things that we've identified in the platform, because I think it's important. This was not a pie-in-the-sky platform that was based on, if we had all the resources in the world and if we could get all the laws passed that we wanted to have passed. The idea behind it was, in the current system, in the current legal system in Connecticut, what powers could the Attorney General exercise, and how could they be directed at significant social problems right now? So that what we're talking about is not a problem of, we need to elect a majority of Greens into the Connecticut legislature in order to get this passed, but something
that'll be in a century or two.
But that we would be looking at the things that could be done presently, that the present administration, and frankly the Republicans and Democrats as well, simply don't have the political will to take on. So in this particular instance, when we were talking about this earlier in the year, I was talking about this in the context of the problem of wage theft. Now, this is something that I encounter in my practice all the time. It's a big part of my practice that I represent folks whose employers don't pay them the minimum wage, or they don't pay overtime wages, or they cheat them out of wages. And sometimes this is a chronic problem, and sometimes it involves very large sums of money. Now, in the state of New York, the Attorney General's office has a division that's devoted to the enforcement of the wage and hour laws. And as you say, in New York, just like here, the people in the Attorney General's office are mostly sitting in offices. They're not out there on the street going, inspecting local workplaces. But what they did do is they created a network of community organizations, labor unions, religious organizations, community by community, who are welcome to participate in this process by sharing information with the Attorney General's office, so that when a local church with a large immigrant population, large immigrant community, the local pastor finds out that 15 or 20 of his workers, of his parishioners who are landscape workers, let's say, are being cheated out of their wages by a local employer, they call the Attorney General's office and say, there's a problem. We've identified the problem. We've identified the people it affects. We need you to step in and utilize the legal system in order to do something about it. So that, so that it really becomes a matter of community action, not just legal action from Hartford, from an office in Hartford, but it actually becomes an action that's rooted in the community for the benefit of the community, for the benefit of the people in the community.
Now, does Connecticut have anything of this sort at this time?
No, absolutely not. We have absolutely nothing like this, and it's not for lack of trying. Those of us who do this kind of work, including a lot of my colleagues in legal services, we've gone to the Department of Labor, we've talked to the relevant officials, we've said, hey, wouldn't it be great if we used our resources to help you guys do your job better? And frankly, they're not interested. Now I know there's a lack of resources, and I know that that's part of the problem. But I also know that that they are viewing these problems as problems that exist on paper, not problems that affect real human beings. Those of us who interact with, who have clients, who are affected by these things, we see the way that it affects them. I had a client a number of years back who, during the time that she was working as a domestic worker and was being kept practically in a state of servitude by her employer, her mother passed away. Her mother was in Latin America, and her mother passed away, and the employer wouldn't allow her to leave.
Oh my God.
And that's not something you can fix after the fact. You can't. It doesn't make any difference how many people we take to court. It doesn't make any difference what kinds of sanctions the courts impose. The court can't fix that problem. So that's why this is the sort of thing that needs to be rooted in the community and not just treated as a legal matter, but something that's really kind of part of the fabric of our communities, of how we treat each other and how we view each other.
Now, you've been running for quite a while now as a minor party candidate, and I'm guessing you have found some real challenges with dealing with the media, dealing with just being able to get the word out that you're running. So do you want to talk a little bit about what the challenges are for people who aren't Democrats and aren't Republicans to not even get recognition, but to, let people know even who they are and that their name will be on the ballot?
Well, it's interesting because Connecticut has, as you know, Connecticut has just about the most restrictive balloting laws of anywhere in the country. When you describe to people the process by which someone can petition to get onto the ballot, it's mind-boggling. We have, as a matter of fact, we have Fred Link this year from the organization Socialist Action. His organization petitioned to get him on the ballot to run for United States Senate. And in order to do that, they had to collect, 7,500?
Yeah, in theory, it's
7,500 signatures. In practice, they turned in about 11,500.
Yeah, I think it was almost 12,000.
Yeah.
I think I heard 11,900.
And when the Secretary of State's office began processing them, they didn't keep any of their deadlines. They failed to provide the organization with any information about what it needed to do in order to try to make sure that that it was getting credit for the signatures that it collected. It failed to pressure the local registrars to do their jobs to make sure that petitions that were turned into a local registrar got turned over to the Secretary of State's office. At every point in the process, as a petitioning candidate, Fred Link got the short end of it. They simply failed to do any of the things that they would have done if he had been a petitioning Democrat or a petitioning Republican. So even at the most official level, at the level of whether or not you get on the ballot, A, it's incredibly burdensome, and B, the Secretary of State's office makes it far more burdensome by their complete lack of cooperation and concern for the for the minor parties. So we have that as an initial problem. Now, to me, if you're able to surmount all those problems and you're able to get candidates onto the ballot and you're able to obtain minor party status the way the Green Party has, it would be logical to say, okay, when you think about how hard you have to work in order to get to that point, it would be logical to say, okay, at this point you've jumped through the hurdles. You've proven that there are people in Connecticut who support your program, who want to be able to vote for you, who want to be able to hear from your candidates. You are, after all, a candidate on the ballot. And we just had this experience just a couple of days ago. The NBC affiliate in the Hartford area, WVIT, on the afternoon of October 1st, announced that evening it was going to be airing a debate of the Attorney General candidates. And that's when I found out that it was going to be airing a debate of the Attorney General candidates that evening. They had not contacted us at all. They hadn't contacted the party. They hadn't contacted me as the candidate. They hadn't reached out to us in any way, shape, or form, even though we're on the ballot, even though the Secretary of State's office has me on the list of candidates on the ballot.
And the Green Party has had held that ballot line since 2006. So we've run someone in every Attorney General campaign since then.
Yeah, and that means that in every one of those elections, we had to have somewhere in the neighborhood of 12,000 voters who actually showed up and voted for the Green Party candidate for that specific office. In fact, we pretty consistently have had about double that number.
Yeah, close to about 20,000, I think.
So I think in the last election it was about 22, it was a little bit over 22,000. So 20,000 to 25,000 people show up at the polls every 4 years to vote for the Connecticut Attorney General candidate. And apparently the local NBC affiliate doesn't think that those voters matter. And that the fact that we're an officially recognized candidate, campaign and party on the ballot doesn't make any difference. They set up a debate. They decided who would be in it. They decided it was going to be the Republican versus the Democrat, and they closed us out of the process altogether. And then they say, well, but you're a minor party. You don't have a lot of popular support. Well, perhaps if they were actually covering our candidates and people had a chance to hear what we had to say, perhaps more people would vote for us. Crazy idea that like having access to the media might somehow help us to be able to get our message to people so that people might be convinced to vote for us. But obviously this is not from the point of view of our NBC station. That's not a consideration. The only thing that matters is that it's about the Democrat versus the Republican.
And I think that's a real problem in terms of, wanting an educated group of voters making these decisions, because I think by framing pretty much every debate as a two-person head-to-head thing, you don't really talk about, it doesn't become about issues.
No.
And as you mentioned, talking about some other things, there are some issues that both the Democrats and Republicans want to keep off the table, that if you don't allow Green Party candidates in, I don't ideologically have very much in common with the Libertarians, but having them in the conversation also shifts it more towards issues and less as almost a sports event.
Well, with respect to this debate that took place the other evening, between William Tong, who's the Democratic Party candidate for Attorney General, and Susan Hatfield, who's the Republican. I think that just about anybody who had seen it would be able to sum it up in 2 sentences. Mr. Hatfield believes that Mr. Tong believes that Susan Hatfield is a proxy for Donald Trump. And Susan Hatfield believes that William Tong is a proxy for Daniel Malloy. And that seems to be about as far as any of it gets. They're stuck on the idea that she's a Republican, so she is following the Trump line, and he's a Democrat, so he's following the Malloy line. And there is no discussion of the issues.
So they didn't talk about racial profiling or education funding or any of the stuff that we talked about tonight.
None of the things that we have talked about this evening appeared in that debate. And it's not it's not to say that they don't discuss any issues, but even the range of opinion. Now, you take an example like the problem of legalization of cannabis, right?
Right.
This is something that the states around us are adopting. Massachusetts is already gearing up to retail marijuana. It's still not legal in Connecticut. There's been a tremendous debate about this. What's the range of debate between the Republican and the Democrat in the Attorney General's office? Well, the Republican is against legalization, and the Democrat is kind of against legalization and isn't sure that it's a good idea. Well, that's not exactly a very wide range. Certainly, the Libertarians and the Greens would have one thing in common if we were participating in this discussion, because we'd be saying, this is crazy. This is just another example of prohibition. It's a tremendous waste of energy and resources to enforce criminal laws against marijuana. That it's economically, it doesn't make any sense. From a tax point of view, it doesn't make any sense. From the point of view of access to medical marijuana for people who need it, it doesn't make any sense. And on top of that, for the purpose of looking at the problem of the war on drugs, it doesn't make any sense.
No, and it's been costing us a lot of money, so you'd think more of the taxpayer advocates would really be in favor of legalization.
And virtually everyone I know who I would put into that category of, the fiscal conservative who says we have to find a way to fund things before we spend money on it. Virtually all of them recognize that the legalization of cannabis would be an important way of doing that.
Yeah.
But the politicians can't get there for some reason.
It's frustrating. My in-laws live in the Pacific Northwest, so every summer we spend time in Oregon State and sometimes in Washington, and the sky hasn't fallen. It's kind of amusing to me being an East Coast person. It's like you're driving around and like you can go on Yelp and find out which dispensaries are better than others.
Sure. They get reviews.
It's capitalism has actually done a pretty good job of keeping things orderly and sorted out. So you don't necessarily have to be a leftist to be in favor of it.
Right. That's right. And in fact, in the general population, the overwhelming majority of people want it legalized. They want it to be available for medical purposes. They want to make sure that it's taxed and that the state gets the revenue from it. And frankly, in a year in which Democrats are actively talking, whether they want to admit it or not, are actively pushing in the direction of reinstituting tolls on our highways, you would think that somebody would have had the guts to say, well, gee, why don't we legalize marijuana and tax it? Wouldn't that be a better idea than putting up toll booths again? Certainly, it's clear to me that the overwhelming majority of folks in the state believe that to be true. The politicians just don't have the guts to do it.
Now, you mentioned Fred Link's challenges a little while ago, and I wanted you to talk a little about an event that's coming up in a few days in New London, because I think some of the viewers might be interested in coming to it.
Sure. And we're actually hoping that this is a first event in New London, but we're actually hoping that we're going to be able to do a similar event in a number of other cities in Connecticut. So on Saturday, October 6th at 1 o'clock at the New London Public Library, we're going to be doing a public forum. And the idea behind the public forum is that it's a discussion by different political organizations on the left about how we view the problem of independent political action, how we view minor parties' participation in electoral politics, the role of the Democrats, the role of Working Families Party, these different topics, because clearly we're at a point in time right now when an awful lot of folks are asking the question, is there anything beyond the Democratic Party in terms of room for progressive politics, for left politics, even for socialist politics? Is there any life outside of the Democratic Party? So the folks who are going to be participating, and it will include, I will be on the panel. Fred Link will be on the panel. Like I said, he's the Socialist Action candidate. Looks like he's going to be a write-in candidate for United States Senate.
I saw a list today of people on the ballot, and his name was not there.
He's not on it.
Even though, if everything was counted, once again, as you said, some things just can't be made right. Retroactively.
Yeah, I think the Secretary of State's office would have to acknowledge at this point that one of the reasons that Fred's campaign doesn't have enough valid signatures, is that the local registrars have not done their jobs properly. And you would think there'd be some sort of context in which the Secretary of State's office would say, well, our job is to make sure that if you have a political opinion and you petition to get on the ballot so that you can have that reflected so that other people can hear it, that we want to make sure that happens. And instead, they treat it as, well, it's just a matter of numbers. If you don't have the right number of signatures, you simply don't get on. Maybe it's our fault that you don't have the right numbers, the right number of signatures. Maybe it's the registrar's fault. Doesn't make any difference. We don't have to fix that.
No, and it actually, I think, adds to their workload, because what happens in petition drives that I've been involved in, you end up just I think 2 years ago in 2016, the Greens turned in like 16,000 signatures for the presidential line, because that's the only way you feel confident that you'll end up with 7,500. And that places an extra burden on the registrars and on the Secretary of State's office. So it is kind of crazy. Well, we have about 5 minutes left. So maybe you can talk to people about how they can find out more about you, what other upcoming events you'll be participating in, and how they can learn more about your platform.
Well, in terms of upcoming events, I can tell you that things have suddenly become very busy. I'm going to be in various places around the state over the next, between now and November 6th, of course. Tomorrow I'm at the Bristol Senior Center in the afternoon, and I'm talking to folks in Bridgeport in the evening. And then on Saturday, I'll be back here in New London and shuttling back and forth for the next few weeks after that. But obviously the best place for people to take a look at my campaign and my platform is my website, which is Goselin4AG.org. So that's
a number 4.
Number 4. So that's GOSELIN, the number 4, AG.org. And in addition to, and I should point out that in addition to folks going there to read about the platform and read about me and take a look at some of the occasions that we've had to talk to the media, they also have the opportunity to donate money.
Yeah, which you can't actually ask for on air. Sorry
That's
to
right.
say that.
Yes, and
but
I can't ask them to do it, but it's there.
But are you asking? Do you need volunteers to do anything statewide?
We are always looking for volunteers to help get out literature and to talk to people, to talk to their neighbors, to organize house parties. Anything that can get the word around to more folks. So there are places on the website where folks can indicate their interest in doing those things. And that would certainly be something that's very, very helpful for us. And because it's on the internet, and of course we also have a page on Facebook, another very simple thing that folks can do is to share those links with other people who they think might have an interest, with their friends and their family.
And I'm hoping that at the Saturday event you'll want it videotaped, and perhaps we can put it up on YouTube.
Yeah, in fact, I understand that folks are working on live streaming it.
Oh, that sounds great.
So on Facebook, and then certainly it should be on YouTube afterwards. But if anyone is interested, certainly if you go to my Facebook page, as soon as I have the information about the live streaming on Saturday, I'll make sure that that's available. And that for folks who can't actually get down to the library, if they want to, if they want to check it out, they'll have an opportunity to. And I should also mention, I said before that we are doing this in other places. If someone listening to your show this evening says, "Gee, I have neighbors. I'd like to have a discussion about this at our house."
Yeah.
That's all it takes. I mean, I'm willing to talk to a half a dozen people, or 10 people, or 100 people.
And this viewing area actually goes in this area, but then it goes north of Norwich to Putnam and Plainfield and Sprague and Killingly. So anyone who's viewing in that area, I think the quiet corner sometimes gets neglected.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I know I'm planning on doing one house party in Norwich presently, but I would definitely like to do more in that area.
So, well, thank you, Peter. I want people to know that I think next week we won't have a live show. One of our Green Party federal candidates, either Michelle Bicking or Jeff Russell, will be the guest, but we'll be taping it ahead of time. And after that, after all the talk about petitioning, we've had quite a few people choosing to run for registrar of voters in their town as third-party registrars, which we see as not a total solution, but a way to help this process of getting people elected, getting people on the ballot beyond just the Democratic and Republican parties.
Definitely provides more transparency if we have folks on the inside who can say, here's how the system works, and we're going to make sure that it does.
Well, thank you, Peter. Everyone who's watching can go to Goselin4AG.org and find out more about Peter. And thanks for coming down to New London to talk to us.
Well, thank you.
Sana Africa, Sana Africa, Sana Africa, we know Africa, yo. Vive Africa, vive Africa, vive Africa, ni nakupenda. Oh, mwimbe Africa, mwimbe Africa, mwimbe Africa, yo.